Hello and welcome to Dissecting Philosophy with Dr. McDonald. In this episode, I'll be continuing my read through of the section of Old and New Law Tables in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So I'll be dealing with the sections 6 to 10 in this episode. So let's get started. Section 6. O my brothers, he who is a firstborn is always sacrificed. Now we are firstborn. We all bleed at secret sacrificial tables. We all burn and roast to the honor of ancient idols. Our best is still young. This excites old palates. Our flesh is tender. Our skin is only a lamb's skin. How should we not excite old idol priests? He still lives on in us, ourselves, the old idol priest, who roasts our best for his feast. Alas, my brothers, how should the firstborn not be sacrifices? But our kind will have it thus, and I love those who do not wish to preserve themselves. I love with my whole love those who go down and perish, for they are going beyond. So we immediately open up in section 6 with this really quite graphic image of sacrifice that's happening, and this whole relation into, as he says, idol priests, and this whole relation back into this sort of religious sacrificial nature, and its whole relation into priests therefore performing it. And out of all that, of course, who is the one that sacrificed is always our firstborn. But what is really Nietzsche getting at here, what is he really meaning, is not that it's in the literal sense, but rather we've got to dig, as always, that little bit deeper. So what is he saying is that we have certain traditions and values that are upheld in the past, and these are performed by certain people who perform the tasks of whatever thing it is, be it a religious organization, so therefore you're the priest, or be it a past form of working, like in the coal mines and so on, all given past ways of performing old duties and so on. There's always somebody to fulfill that whole structure and way of life, and for someone to therefore play it out. And next then comes in the whole argument to say, well, that's not so bad then. Why is there this whole discussion about sacrifice that goes on? And then I say, hold on a tick and I'll tell you. Because whenever we're dealing with past organizations or ways of life or structures of jobs and so on, there's always that whole idea again that people have to fit in to the given model and given structure and order to conform to that and fit in. And therefore, when anybody comes around and says, but wait a minute, isn't actually working in the coal mine dangerous because of such and such health conditions, or the also physical dangers of working in the coal mines as well? That may be the given case, but what about the money? So it's that whole idea of there that, well, in order for a new idea to come in and to try to challenge something, here we have Nietzsche then say, well, I love those people who are going to be the ones who wish to ultimately go straight in for it and say they don't wish to preserve themselves, because our immediate first reaction to it, of course, is to think about your own job, your own safety, your own living conditions, and to say, well, I know the risks, but I need the money more, so therefore I'm going to do the job. Nietzsche's, in that given instance, say, well, no, even though you know the risks, you need to take those on and fight for that, because in doing so, you're going to be the one that'll open the door for everybody else, and to therefore help everybody and unionize and so on, and have a very positive, constructive way, and for everybody to have better working conditions, better paid wages, and so on, rather than just accepting it and just moving on. So it's that whole thing of when a new thing comes in, it's to say, wow, it could be a very challenging idea, or maybe not. Maybe it's not a very big idea. Sometimes the big ideas don't have to be something that's going to try and criticize the entire thing, like the whole thing to do with coal mining. Sometimes it's something as significant as the minimum pay rise and so forth for fast food workers and so forth for McDonald's when they want those wages raised. And that's another great example in which we can say, well, in that given instance, people have to put their own principles first over their own circumstances, and to basically put their own job security on the line in order for everybody to argue for a very positive and constructive thing for everybody, arguing for a minimum amount to be raised because that amount needs to be raised in order for everybody to have better living conditions ultimately post them not working at whatever job it is that they have. And it's really that whole point, as Nietzsche says as well, to have that strength and courage and conviction to be able to be fired for want to stand up for your principles and beliefs in the first place, to risk everything in order to fight for the resolution of whatever problems it's been highlighted, in order for everybody to benefit from that resolution of that problem. Good for you, ultimately, what Nietzsche is saying. That's absolutely fantastic. You should be absolutely praised as a fantastic individual for that conviction and courage. But of course, there's a massive but in that to say, well, yes, it is amazing for those individuals who can do that. But at the same time, it's my God, you're literally risking everything at the same time, because there is no monetary value to be gained out of it and so on. And then the horror of that, the thought of an unemployment just because of what you're saying, and the fact that they could fire you on the spot for it and so on. So the amount of mental courage and conviction is just amazing that people have when they take that stance to fight for exactly the principles that they believe in. Section 7. To be truthful, few can do it, and those who can will not. Least of all, however, can the good be truthful. All these good men never tell the truth. To be good in that way is a sickness of the spirit. They yield, these good men, they acquiesce, their hearts imitate, they obey from the heart. But he who obeys does not listen to himself. All that the good call evil must come together that one truth may be born. O my brothers, are you, too, evil enough for this truth? The bold attempt, prolonged mistrust, the cruel no, say ye, the cutting into the living. How seldom did these come together? But from such seed is truth raised. Hitherto all knowledge has grown up beside the bad conscience. Shatter, you enlightened men, shatter the old law tables. So it's an absolutely great line that good men never tell the truth. To be good in that way is a sickness of the spirit. Because you can see here a really nice, easy example to get exactly what it's talking about is that situation where men are put in, where you have the partner try on a new outfit. And then you have, of course, the question, does my butt look big in this? Which then, of course, comes the reply, no, of course, sweetie. Your butt does not look big in it whatsoever. When that's a complete white lie, potentially, of course. So that's the whole point of, well, you're lying to yourself at that same time, but in order to keep the truth from the other person, the partner in that given situation. In order for not only you to look like a complete butthead, but also not for you to therefore hurt her feelings at the same time as that. But then comes in that fantastic next part. You're not listening to yourself because your conscience is literally going to be telling you at that given point exactly what it thinks, which will be the truth. And then you're going to go against what you yourself are thinking and believing. So what you're going to absolutely be trying to uphold is this some sort of ideal, perfect image and space that doesn't actually fit in with what you believe and you actually think in order for everybody else to be completely happy. So we have this complete clash between reality and ideality, and in order for everybody to be happy, we can't have reality hit in any given way. Everybody has to live in this idealistic, perfect state where everybody's butt's perfect in every single thing that's going to be tried out. And this is the really interesting point that really Nietzsche's touched upon here, because this is where the ethics comes into it and touches upon the ethics in the last section as well. Why is it so important that we have this whole relation into wanting to have this security and so forth in the first place? Is because we have that ideal image of being the perfect husband, being the perfect partner, and so on, and this whole idealistic lifestyle that's built for us and given to us within society, that then we say, well, I need to be like this image and this person. And of course, the irony of that is every single time is like, well, I am not this idealistic person because, let's say, the ideal is for everybody to be married in a heterosexual relationship with 2 children, 1 boy and 1 girl. Well, that's not going to work because it only gives one specific aspect of what society is. So suddenly this little portion of society is then used as a massive broad stroke for how everybody else should live. So immediately, everybody who doesn't fit into that ideal is immediately marginalized. So in this given instance, then you'd be marginalized because of your ethnicity and your sexuality, and also your ability to be able to reproduce at the same time. And what is interesting then is those points that Nietzsche makes, as how interesting it is when the whole aspect of the bold attempt, prolonged mistrust, the cruel no, satiety, so being full, the cutting into the living, how seldom do these come together? So it's that really point that he says is we have this tension immediately that's created within ideality because it tries to create a thing that everybody has to therefore try to uphold, and everybody upholds it as a good thing for everybody to aspire to, but the problem is that it's unrealistic, and therefore it's going to run against all the problems that it doesn't take into account of. And so those are going to be great things because they're going to be problems that can precisely challenge this ideality and generality that's been set up within society. And it's once we have that mistrust of this image, once we say, no, I don't accept this, once we say, I'm too full, I've had enough of this now, basically, then the interest and movement starts to happen, because then he says we start to move towards truth and starting to understand the actual situation for what's going on. And of course, we can go into fantastic different historical periods as well for, well, the challenge of the image of the African American in the 50s that was created, and the fantastic black civil rights movement and so on. That was that whole movement of saying, no, I'm not going to take this anymore. That mistrust of that image and so on. Same thing for the gay rights movement. Saying, no, we're not going to get treated like this anymore. No. Section 8. When water is planked over so that it can be walked upon, when gangway and railings span the stream, truly he is not believed who says everything is in flux. On the contrary, even simpletons contradict him. What? Say the simpletons? Everything's in flux? But there are planks and railings over the stream. Over the stream, everything is firmly fixed. All the values of things, the bridges, the concepts, all good and evil, all are firmly fixed. But when hard winter comes, the animal tamer of streams, then even the cleverest learn mistrust. And truly, not only the simpletons say then, is not everything meant to stand still? Fundamentally, everything stands still. That is a proper winter doctrine, a fine thing for unfruitful seasons, a fine consolation for hibernators and stay-at-homes. Fundamentally, everything stands still. The thawing wind, however, preaches to the contrary. The thawing wind, an ox that is no ploughing ox, a raging ox, a destroyer that breaks ice with his angry horns. Ice, however, breaks gangways. Oh, my brothers, is everything not now in flux? Have not all railings and gangways fallen to the river and come to nothing? Who can still cling to good and evil? Woe to us! Hail to us! The thawing wind is blowing. Preach thus, O my brothers, through every stream. So, everything is in flux. And this whole idea of everything being in flux is from the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus. And so we have this fantastic relation between Nietzsche here affirming Heraclitus' idea. And the way to get into how Heraclitus thinks is through another one of his famous sayings as well. You can never step into the same river twice. And so, if you just work through the process of that, how come you can't step into the same river twice? You can walk forward, you can walk back, you can walk across and so forth, but you can never step into the same river twice. Because the answer is that the river is in a constant, continual stream all the time as it's continually going along, and so it's never the same part of the river that you're stepping into every single time. And that's how the river works as a metaphor for how to think about how the world is in this constant state of change and transformation. And so we think about it in terms of a very gradual change, let's say through the seasons, winter, spring, summer, autumn, back into winter, and so on. But the way in which Heraclitus wants us to think is in a much more dramatic idea of change, and is to think about it in the very dynamic way it happens on an every second basis, like the river is happening all the time. And a good way to think about that, of course, is the way that we could think about now how things change at molecular levels all the time. And things are in the process of decay, of course, like trees are in a constant process of decay. And it's only through a certain time period that we are able to notice this. But if we're able to whip out a microscope and so forth and analyze it, then we'd be able to have a much more greater idea and visually see it happening right before our eyes. And that's the whole point about everything is in this continual state of transformation and change. On the opposite side of that is the other pre-Socratic philosopher, Parmenides. And the thing about Parmenides is he's one of those great mathematician philosophers, and so takes very much the point of arguing against this notion of flux, because he sees it as harmful, because if everything is in a state of continual change, it would ultimately be chaotic to the point of how could you say at any given point it is a thing that exists in any given way? How could we analyze it in any shape or form if it's in a state of continual change? And so his argument is to say, well, we don't need to look at change in this dynamic way. Rather, we need to take the universal properties out of it, very much leaning on the mathematical side of things. And therefore, if we're able to analyze these aspects of things, then we'll arrive at a very much more concrete argument. And so we can then apply that across board, and then we'll have knowledge and so on. Here we can see that Nietzsche is really coming into then the rebuttal against the sort of Parmenides side of things back onto the Heraclitus to say, well, imagine if you were on a river and then that river froze, as he said. And then imagine if it was an animal that was on there. Let's imagine that fantastic scene with Bambi. So a lovely deer trying to keep its balance on that poor little river as it goes. And so he says, well, what is it meant to do? Stand still? And that's, of course, the point that Nietzsche is trying to make, is what are you trying to do at this given point to knowledge in its relation to mathematics? Are you trying to make it stand still, basically? Because that's not how knowledge works. You can't have knowledge just ultimately stand still. Knowledge doesn't work like a photograph. You just can't have this one snapshot and say that's it for all eternity, just this one picture of knowledge. That's not how it works. Even when it comes to mathematics and mathematical truths, we have this continual change in how things work within maths. One of the biggest changes was Euclidean geometry to non-Euclidean geometry, because everybody thought Euclidean geometry was the absolute bee's knees, and then people came along and thought, no, Euclidean geometry is not bee's knees, because there's this instead. And then out popped non-Euclidean geometry, and so on, and all the different forms of mathematics and so on that you have, and that even within maths, you don't have just absolutely one form that's absolutely dominant over and above all others either. So let's go back into that point that Nietzsche wants to make. When we try to argue in a traditional philosophical sense for an absolute universal basis for knowledge, we're ultimately trying to be like a deer stuck on this poor river and got told to just stand still and don't move. And we're just able to just stand there wobbling our legs about. What then happens? He says, the thorn wind happens. So nature happens. And that's a really interesting point, is to say, well, this is the fragility of human knowledge at this point, isn't it? And so say, well, on the one hand, we can say, well, yes, knowledge is a thing that transforms, because there's always going to be those new theories and hypotheses and so forth that will challenge and progress knowledge on in various different disciplines and fields and so on. And we need to affirm all that. But also, isn't it just really interesting when he says it's a thawing wind, and then it's an ox, that's an angry ox that smashes all this river, and it has absolutely no relation into humanity at all. It's all relation into nature and how nature works in relation to change. And there's this whole sort of deeper interest and remark here being made about the very fragility of our knowledge as a species here, because we ourselves are like a snapshot. We have only existed for a certain period of time, and therefore what will happen after the species is, of course, nature will still go on, and the thorn wind will go on, and the ox, in whatever shape and form it will be, will go on, and so on. And that's what will happen, is that continual sense of transformation and change that happens out with us as well. It's not solely a human thing that we have control over. It's completely with our grasp. Only what we can do is analyze the change. We can't really have any whole sense of trying to have fundamental godlike power over trying to control it. And then again, the very fragility of knowledge itself as well. What happens when the rivers come through, the winds have come through? Who can cling precisely to their ideas of good and evil then? What happens when the Roman civilization came through, pillaged, plundered, destroyed all the different aspects of a culture? What happened to their good and evil then? It's that whole aspect again. Well, what happens to our ideas now? They'll be wiped away over time. They're not something that's absolute. Why not? Because precisely knowledge is something that's dependent upon something that's outside our reach, which is the idea of transformation, change, and the flux. Section 9. There is an old delusion that is called good and evil. Up to now, this delusion has orbited about prophets and astrologers. Once people believed in prophets and astrologers, and therefore people believed everything is fate. You shall, for you must. Then again, people mistrusted all prophets and astrologers, and therefore people believed everything is freedom. You can, for you will. Oh, my brothers, up to now there has been only supposition, not knowledge, concerning the stars and the future, and therefore there has hitherto been only supposition, not knowledge, concerning good and evil. So a supposition is basically a posh way of saying hypothetical. In the definition here from Google, we have a belief held without proof or certain knowledge, an assumption or hypothesis. So we have that whole relation into ancient goings on with looking to the stars for ultimately guidance for how we should live our lives. And we still have that within modern astrology, we only need to go to astrology.com, choose whatever horoscope we fancy, Capricorn, Virgo, Aries, and so on. Let's just look at the one for Capricorn for today. And it says, today, if you're in any kind of competition, you need to work extra hard to keep your eye on the ball. The prize is yours to lose, so it's more important than ever to believe in yourself. Ignore any psychological games that your opponent might try to play. Concentration is the key to your success, and it's a good thing that the universe is sending you so much of it. Avoid flighty people who will distract you. Their unfocused energy is the last thing you need right now. And that's all fantastic to tell people, of course, who are those people who are Capricorns. But it's that whole line of, well, it's completely hypothetical. You could say whatever you like because there's actually no given proof of what people are saying in that given way. And it goes back into then even what Nietzsche says. Well, immediately we're incredibly suspicious of astrologers and of prophets, and suddenly we say, well, you're just saying all this stuff about the moon and the stars, and when Venus passes over Saturn and such will happen, and so on. Our immediate response is just, well, actually none of this is determined by the stars and so forth. It's very much, I'm the one that's in control of what happens in the world. I'm in control of the world and my actions, as he says. And then what's the really interesting twist out of the whole thing is that just as we think about the stars and how astrology is meant to have an effect on people's life, that also works when people think of the future, because that's only a possibility. It's only a hypothesis, basically, because we have no actual clue for how it's going to turn out. That doesn't mean to say there isn't, of course, fantastic pieces of sci-fi, but what does always that sci-fi tend to do is, yes, it's about a fantastic future, but it's really representing about deeper problems within contemporary society at that given time period as well. And so we've got that relation into the stars, we have that relation to the future, and then we have the relation into ethics, where Nietzsche's going to make that comparison. And this is because ethics works on a hypothesis, on hypothetical situations that are then actualized and have to be acted upon by individuals. So it's always thinking of such and such circumstances. What if this happens? What would you do then? And it's that almost astrological relation back into that. We'll say, well, you could use the same hypothetical situation of, well, the astrologer says this and that's going to happen to you in your everyday life as well. A famous ethical example is the fat man example, which is also called the trolley problem. As it says here on the Wikipedia page for it, there is a runaway trolley barreling down the railway tracks. Ahead on the tracks, there are 5 people tied up and unable to move. The trolley is headed straight for them, you standing some distance off in the yard next to a lever. If you pull this lever, the trolley will switch to a different set of tracks. However, you notice that there is one person on the side track. You have 2 options. 1, do nothing and allow the trolley to kill the 5 people on the main track. 2, pull the lever, diverting the trolley onto the side track where it will kill 1 person. Which is the more ethical option? Or more simply, what is the right thing to do? And it's that point in which Nietzsche says, well, there you have philosophy's version of astrology at work. You have a complete hypothetical situation in what some sort of madman, almost comic villain-esque situation to try and resolve the problem of. Is that an actual realistic problem that most people will encounter in their life? Or is that just going to be some sort of hypothetical situation that more or less a superhero or a cowboy or some sort of heroic protagonist has to try and resolve the problem of? It's more leaning heavily on that than on the realistic situation. And what is the whole point of what Nietzsche is saying as well is this is what we've allowed to happen in ethics, is we've taken these models and this whole astrological approach to doing it, as he says, and gotten away from the whole relation into realistic aspect out of it. Well, shouldn't we think about ethics and morality much more in real practical examples rather than in ideal hypothetical examples? Section 10. You shall not steal, you shall not kill. Such words were once called holy. In their presence people bowed their knees and their heads and removed their shoes. But I ask you, where have there ever been better thieves and killers in the world than such holy words have been? Is there not in all life itself stealing and killing? And when such words were called holy, was not truth itself killed? Or was it a sermon of death that called holy that which contradicted and opposed all life? O my brothers, shatter, shatter the old law tables. So then we have this whole relation rounding off into section 10 about stealing and killing. And what immediately then hits off as a target straight away is, of course, Christianity and Nietzsche saying about the hypocritical nature in which Christianity has said for people to oppose these ideas of stealing and killing when haven't Christians done exactly the same in the name of Christ? And a great example of that, at least historically, is the Crusades, killing in the name of Christ in order to take back the land of Jerusalem. And so we could fit in a nice little bit of history here as well, where we can say that the Crusades took place between 1096 and 1271, and what kicked the whole thing off was that Pope Urban II decided that Christians in Europe had a duty to win back that tiny strip of land in the Middle East around Jerusalem, because this was the holy land where Jesus Christ had lived and died. And so there is that incredible amount of irony when you have precisely the words of you shall not steal, you shall not kill, and you're going out precisely not only for one war, but for 9 crusades in total there were over a span of 200 years, and the amount of fighting and killing and death and so on that took place, all in the name of Christ. But the whole key of this section comes out when he says the line, and when such words were called holy, was not truth itself killed? Because it goes into that whole argument to say, well, you have no means of arguing against that view there, because you'd be seen as a heretic and you'd be blasphemous, you'd be going against the word, and you'd be executed more than likely as well. And it's precisely that's the point in which Nietzsche says, well, isn't this the point here, that we never want to take a set of words in such a way to have this amount of power, because, as he says, what does it ultimately act as is a sermon of death opposed to all life, because everything in that whole doctrine is focused on the afterlife in the first place. It's opposed to life itself and the here and now, and for people to try and oppose that view that, well, maybe it isn't Christian to go and do a thing like the Crusades in the first place. So therefore argues for a much more liberal idea of what religion should be. And so the whole ideas should be in a dynamic process where they would be subject to change and debate and so forth over time, and never to be held as absolute static tenets like they would be back in the Middle Ages, for instance. So overall, for sections 6 to 10, then we've touched upon various different aspects of ethics and also dealing with the whole relation into transformation, change, and flux. Next time, we continue to still press on with the fantastic section of old and new law tables as we work our way up to number 30. Many thanks for listening to the episode. Feel free to look at my Patreon page at patreon.com/dissectingphilosophy. I'm going to try my very best to get it all updated with all the recent episode notes I've got down, and take a little picture and put it online for everybody to see. Also, you can feel free to drop me a wee email with a question at my address at dissectingphilosophy@gmail.com. Feel free to tip me a wee coffee at ko-fi.com/dissectingphilosophy. And lastly, I can be found on Twitter at I am a rubberman. Many thanks for listening, and I'll hope you'll join me next time.